Hey everyone, welcome to our last short talk on the book of Job. This is going to be fairly short because there's not a lot I can say without going into the entire kit and caboodle, which would take a lot of lecture hours. So I wanted to point out just a few things on our sort of 10 things about list, some ideas for you to go perhaps later and study more deeply into the book of Job. Number one, the New International Bible Commentary is available to you through Fuller, so you can go in there and find the source where I pulled quite a few of my facts from for this particular talk. And I would recommend highly, if you want to go more deeply into it, that's a really nice place to start from. Carol Newsom is the author of that particular commentary introduction and the commentary on Job itself, and she points out that the themes in the book include the idea of suffering, the idea of justice. In other words, where does God fit? Where does suffering fit in the justice of God? And she points out an interesting one that I did want to credit her with about the idea of order and chaos in creation. In other words, Job's life is at one point orderly. It goes into sort of chaotic discussion and then goes back to being orderly. This is a feature, in fact, of the way the book is structured. So you have a structure that includes at chapter 1 to 2:13 a prose story. Okay, so this is where we hear about Job and his piety and the idea that Satan, Hasatan, is going to be allowed to test him. Here it's really important to remember that we don't have a full-blown theology of Satan with a capital S. So Hasatan in this particular setting is the actually, he's the one that's going to go in there and test and cause trouble, but he's not necessarily the character we think of as wrapped up in a red outfit with little pointy ears and so forth and so on. Okay, so basically the term in Hebrew means the adversary rather than the devil, which we get from New Testament. Okay, when this very statement is quoted in the New Testament in Peter, where Satan himself is credited with going after and looking for whom he may devour. However, that's a thought history thing that happens on top of this after many, many years and then includes Greek thinking as well. So when you're reading Job, it's really good to sort that out and realize that we have here an adversary, the one that's going to call up ideas against Job and that kind of thing. And it brings it into a little bit of a different plane. From chapter 3 through chapter 46, verse 6, we have a huge debate going on between Job and his friends. And this comes up in 3 cycles where Eliphaz speaks, Job speaks, Bildad speaks, Job speaks, Zophar speaks. There's at chapter 28, an entire chapter on wisdom pops in. And then we have Job speaking to God and Elihu's speeches. Elihu is very late to this party, actually. And then the story ends up at the end, or the book ends up at the end with another prose story from 42:7 to 17, where Job is restored. So the first and the last sections sound a little bit like telling a good fairy tale to the kids, right? Once upon a time this happened, blah, 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 and they lived happily ever after. But in the middle, the huge poetic section, if we're talking genre there, we have something that's in very high-flown poetry. And this poetry points toward a wisdom sort of genre. And so on the one hand, you have wisdom in the speeches of the friends, and then we have that full-blown chapter on wisdom, which is really nice to read. Talks a lot about God's role in creation and so forth and so on, but it doesn't really knit to the way the rest of the whole poetic section is working. So people have asked, where did this come from? Okay. So the book of Job in its literary context is found in the writings, and it's found in the writings in both the Hebrew canon and in the Christian canon. So we can look at that as being a pretty reliable source, that we're looking at something that we might consider to be art. In fact, we could look at Job as being one of the best examples of theology in art that we can find in Scripture. And I kind of think Job, the writer of Job, would fit nicely with the Fuller setting, where we tend to put theology and art together as opposed to theology plus propositions. And that's something really interesting to think about, because I think in a way Job speaks in a way that we can hear, and it's a way that is different than propositional theology per se. So that would be one of my high points for going in and looking at this book a little bit more. having trouble deciding how to put together a sermon or a lesson, perhaps we could go to something that's artistic as opposed to something that's more propositional like the Book of Paul. So I would highly recommend that particular thing. The historical context for the Book of Job is very tenuous. We cannot attach to it dates and that kind of thing like we can with some of the prophetic books. And so it is one of those books that tends to spread over time really well, because the way the theology works is a little bit more broad than perhaps what we would get with either a prophetic book or, say, the Book of Kings, that kind of thing. So where we find some really interesting stuff is when you get to point number 6, the idea of tradition and intertext. And here, this also then goes to point 7, talking about extra biblical information. So for tradition, we have the book of Ezekiel. Okay, in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 14, verses 13 and 20, Ezekiel mentions some people who are very righteous. Noah, who is pre-Israelite, Daniel, who is actually not the Daniel we just spoke of, but Daniel is a legendary Canaanite king, and then the book of Job himself as a character. So some would see this, that the book itself of Job is not original necessarily to an Israelite context, but has been brought into Israelite religious context. And in Ezekiel, we see this pulling in as well of these characters. So both the book of Job and this idea of the characters probably was incorporated by the 6th century BCE. So it's a pretty old tradition. And again, attested to in the book of Ezekiel. So that again leaves us out there with this very strange prophetic voice. And one of my more favorite classes to have taught was the book of Ezekiel, because the prophetic voice in there is quite different to Isaiah and Jeremiah. He's very vivid, and this goes along then also with the book of Job, where we have very vivid descriptions of action. Okay, so the prose parts of the book do not show many clues to an extra biblical context. So the prose parts could come from pretty much anywhere. But the poetry does seem to go hand in hand with poetry of the ancient Near East and the surrounding areas, such as Egypt or Ugarit and that kind of thing. So the way the poems are written, Carol Newsom would even say that they were not Israelite necessarily in origination. I probably personally would not go that far, but I think it's interesting that there is that much of a cultural, not a contrast, but a cultural similarity between Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Ugaritic type poetry and the Book of Job, the characteristics in there, and the way that some of the material actually goes together. And I think the tie-in with it, for me, would be these wisdom themes. So again, if you go ahead and hit up the commentary that's available to you, the NIV commentary, you can look and see examples of how this might work and how similar that they are, and also how different they are, because we end up getting Yahweh, who is quite different, of course, to the gods of the other nations. Now, in biblical and theological terms, what do we do with the book of Job? Okay, so we have several themes going on here. What does it mean to be a person of piety? What does it mean to be a person who obeys God? What does it mean to be a person who is kind of put upon by the adversary? And I'm sure most of us have gone through some different times when we're going, oh my gosh, what's going on here? I feel like somebody's really like getting after me and that kind of thing. What is that all about, theologically speaking? What is the so-called proper conduct of a person who is suffering? Okay, the friends would have you think that one would be very pious and very sober, and God is God, and we're going to allow it to go on. Job shows us an example that is not the same as the friends' moral and religious self-examination, according to Carol Newsom. Job is different. He's claiming that God has no right to make or allow people to suffer unless the suffering is deserved. And his response, of course, is quite emotional and lots of reaction and a lot of confrontation of God. So if we liked reading lament psalms, we're going to really like seeing what Job's reaction is, because I think in a way his is the more common reaction to going through a time of struggle. Even though in our heads we may think I should be very pious about this and God is God and we're going to go for it. I think the internal struggle that can be there sometimes, the wrestling, the trying to figure it out, all of that kind of thing is a little bit more like Job's response. And we see that despite everything that the friends said to Job, that God says Job spoke what is right about God. And so that's very interesting to see, because according to Job, the character of God would be contradictory and a little bit sometimes more hostile than what we would be accustomed to seeing. So these are a few thoughts on the book of Job, and I really hope that you get a chance to dig in farther, maybe taking a class on writings or taking a class on wisdom literature, or just doing some reading on your own, because it's really quite fascinating, and it does give us another piece of scripture that's not necessarily what everybody's expecting. So this does make for some pretty good lessons and sermons, and also just contemplation for ourselves about what is the role of suffering in the life of the Christian. I want to thank you all for being an outstanding bunch of people. It's been really fun to have you in class. I'm looking forward to hearing from you and seeing what other kinds of things you're going to get up to as time goes by. Take care and God bless. Bye now.